Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mariela Colon with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's virtual program is in support of our summer programming initiative, Make Summer Yours, which includes all ages programming starting June 28th, inspired by all things art. Check out our full list of programs online. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Tonight it is my pleasure to welcome Chin and Andrew Nerger of Road To Infamy Games. Jeff and Andrew are high school friends from Chicago, living out their dream as game designers, publishers, and co-owners of R2I Games. Jeff handles art direction and graphic design, while Andrew is responsible for the business and logistics end. Together, they design games with easy-to-learn rules and deep strategic gameplay. Their favorite board games right now are Scythe and Res Arcana. Jeff and Andrew are cautiously optimistic Bears fans. Again, we will be monitoring the chat for questions, so feel free to ask a question in YouTube.
All right. So if you're a board game publisher or you're an illustrator looking to get into the board game industry, Jeff and I really feel like the best way to start inundating yourself with the world of board game art is just to jump in, look at some boxes, and find some artwork that appeals to you. And so we're going to be sharing a couple of artists that really appeal to us. We're going to kind of talk through what we think makes their art so unique and special. And the first one we want to start with is Marie Cardoz. She made Dixit among a number of games. And when Jeff and I were first looking for board game artists, we typed in top 10 board game illustrators, and Marie was at the top. She's got this very friendly, familiar style, almost like a children's book illustrator style to the way she does her art. She's a painter, so all of her art pieces are hand painted, and it gives a special feel to the game. So she's just incredible and is a big inspiration for Jeff and I. Next slide. Another great artist is Kyle Farren. You can see that he has a different art style. He's has a more cartoony style, cartoonist style. His big inspiration was Bill Watterson, who made Calvin Hobbes. And I think you can tell from the way his art looks. What is really special about Kyle Farren as well and his artwork is that the games he illustrates are very complex, where Dixit is a very quick and easy family game. Games like Vast and Root are hyper complex. They're asymmetric gameplay is what we say in the industry. And that means every person has a different goal in the game and they have different rules for playing. So part of the reason why these games have done so well is just because everyone sees Kyle Farren's art and just has to play it and can get past the rules because of it. Next slide. All right. Katherine Hamilton's another artist we really appreciate. She's a wilderness conservationist and a bird watcher, and she's worked on a number of games based around nature, the environment, animals. So you can see she's done a game called Oceans and Evolution. She's a watercolor artist. So we've seen a painter, we've seen a cartoonist, and now we see someone who's using watercolor. Just like those types of art, hers is very striking and memorable and super beautiful. So next slide. Next, we have Ryan Lockett, very interesting artist. He's not only the illustrator, but he is also the designer and publisher of a number of really well-selling games. What's interesting about his art style is he carries it across all the games he makes. Sleeping Gods and Above and Below not only have the same artwork, but they exist in the same world. So he wants that thread and his players to have that feeling that this is a very familiar world they're crossing through. Next slide. Next, we have Kwanzaa Morai. Another great illustrator. He uses multiple mediums. He uses acrylic paint, and he also uses digital painting. You can kind of tell with the two his most well-known games that we've kind of shared here, which is Crypt and Dinosaur Island. Dinosaur Island has a lot of nice line work, and Cryptid, you know, is in a very different style from that. So what's nice about Kwanzaa is that he really tries to bring a new style of art to each game he's working on. So he's so versatile, and yet all his illustrations are always very striking. And Jeff, and it's always eye-catching when we see those new games come out. Next slide. The next one's Jaka Brazovsky. What's really interesting story from Jakob is he's an illustrator who's just made hundreds of illustrations of this world. It's a post-World War II steampunk theme with mechs, and he was just pumping out all these illustrations that were beautiful, and kind of like a publisher's dream, Stonemaier Games came across his artwork and said, hey, can we use this for our game? So they didn't have to seek him out, get quotes. All the art was done, and they just could add it to their own game. It's just such an easy process that way. So it was great that Jakob just had this really striking artwork that could inspire game design. You know, this is a time when it went the other direction. It was like illustrations first in a way, and then game design almost second. All right, next slide. The final artist we'd like to kind of share with everyone is Fernando Suarez. She's from Chile, and another really well-known designer. Ashes and Century are huge games, and she is another artist who can pull off lots of different looks. She's a really great character artist. She did over 200 illustrations by herself for Ashes, which is a huge feat. And she can also do these amazing scenery panoramic views like you see from Century. So she just has so many styles that she brings to the table. A really nice thing about this day and age is that there's great artists all around the world, and you know, you can find them everywhere. So those are the illustrators that
my name's Jeff Chin, and one of my many roles here at R2I Games is I'm the art director, which means I'm always thinking about illustrative styles and trying to come up with kind of the overall look and feel for the game. I also do all the graphic design, and I used to do the illustration for some of our earlier titles. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit today about kind of how art and graphic design work together in board games in an interesting way to really bring the game experience together. So let's take a look at the next slide. All right, so the interesting part about board games is that illustrations serve more of a purpose than just looking pretty. It's very much about the user experience, and everything that you see in a board game is intentionally designed to have a practical purpose as well, because players need to be able to look at components and interact with them and understand what they are doing. So in every single aspect, both illustration and graphic design, we're seeing kind of a balance of aesthetic versus a more practical function. When we're looking at iconography in board games, which is usually little icons in corners of cards, like you can kind of see in the upper left corner of that rightmost picture in the slide there, it's important to come up with icons that are very readable, that have nice contrast. They need to look appealing, but first and foremost, the actual understandability and the readability of those icons from a distance is very important, right? Oftentimes when you're playing a board game, there's a card across the table that you're considering. Maybe you want to buy that card in the game. Maybe you want to trade with another player, and you need to be able to read that information very quickly at a distance. So it's very important to kind of create that nice contrast in your iconography. with typography. That's something that's evolved a lot over the years in board games, and it's gotten better and better. It's important to be able to make all the words very readable and understandable, just like iconography. You can kind of see in the examples on the slide, from Magic in 1995 all the way to Keyforge from 2018. These are both the same designer, and the card design has come such a long way in being able to just be understandable at a glance. And part of that is keeping, text shorter. But more than that, it's having like the right amount of negative space around typography as well, to keep it visually appealing and not overwhelming feeling. And along with typography comes font choice and choosing fonts that stylistically fit the aesthetic of your game. And but on top of that, once again, it has to be readable, right? Like it could be fun to choose some Old West font or some curly script font if that fits the style of your game. But as a art director for a game, you're always looking for, function first. It needs to work for your players. Your players need to always be able to understand that aspect of the game. Color palette too. When we think of color palettes, we usually just think of, it has to be appealing, and that's all that matters. But, there's a large portion of the population that is colorblind, and that's something we always have to take into consideration with our illustrations and graphic design, and making sure we're using color palettes that are practical to use for people with all kinds of vision. Use nice contrast, use appealing color combinations, but also color combinations that work for everyone. So let's take a look at the next slide. So here's kind of an example where I don't know that the graphic design and illustration are totally working in harmony here. We can see the board on the left has a very beautiful, very detailed illustration. And it's also used as a component where game components are placed on the board. And you can kind of see on the right when some of those graphics overlay on top of a highly detailed illustration, everything starts to become a little bit blurry and a little bit confusing where the lines are. So when working with illustrations in games, you also have to consider the gameplay and how you will physically interact with that component, and make sure that you don't have elements competing with each other. So let's check out the next slide. All right, material and printing. So it's always important to consider the components you're working with. What I mean by that is we're looking at the size of the component and the amount of detail, the number of colors to include on it. Size is very important because a lot of board game components are very small, as you know, right? We have little pieces as small as like this ribbon token from Canvas. And obviously I'm not going to put some super highly detailed illustrations on this. So a lot of small tokens tend to be a little more graphic designy, with like clear-cut icons that can be read at a distance, high contrast, simple colors. You can kind of see on here, like it's just the all-white star on like a more solid green background, versus when you're working with cards, you have a lot more room to play with, so you can have a more high detailed illustration, and then you can still include the iconography with the more high contrast colors on it. So you always just have to take that into account. Again, if you're using something small like dice, you can see in that example from Railroad Inc., they have just the very simple railroads and road patterns on those dice. And that serves a very specific function in that game, where players actually have to physically draw those things on their board. So that was an artistic choice that they made in that game, to keep those designs as simple as possible so that anybody can draw that. So once again, always just keeping kind of the player mindset in mind when you are creating the visual assets. And if we look at those meeples at the top from Paladins of the West Kingdom, I believe those are some extra meeples designed by the Meeple Source teams, and they do a really awesome job there. I just wanted to point these out because they do such a good job creating a recognizable character using just a couple colors. And I think it's important when working with a small token that's only about 15 millimeters tall to be able to make it readable, you know, and not complicate it with too much detail. So let's take a look at the next slide. It's always important to consider your audience when deciding on your artistic style. A lot of people infer a lot about your game just by looking at the cover. From looking at the components, you can kind of gather how complex or how simple the game is going to be. So looking at some of these examples, the children's games have a lot brighter of colors. Things are spaced out, a lot of negative space in there. It kind of implies some of that simplicity you might experience while playing those games versus more of a hobby game like Scythe. I've got the box right here so you can see it a little bit, but now that is a mural of a piece. It is a huge, beautiful, detailed work of art by Jaka Brazovsky, some of my favorite board game art. But just looking at this, obviously you know, you might not bust that out with your grandparents if that's not really their board gaming level. So make sure, always think about who the audience of your game is, and the style of the art can really bring people in, and you certainly don't want a mismatch there. You can you might have gamers expectations kind of off if that style doesn't match. Let's check out the next slide. So kind of going along with that is shelf presence. It's important in board game illustration to remember that your game is not just a pretty work of art, but it is also a product, right? And it's something that's going to sit on the shelf. And when people are browsing at retail stores or searching online, people's eyes gravitate to certain colors and certain types of illustrations, and it's important to consider those things when coming up with the box art for your game. So here's a couple of solid examples. So looking at that Orchard game on the left, they use some really bright saturated colors that really draw your eyes. I really like the Time Stories box in the middle just because it's so minimalist. It's very simple, almost has like a Apple product kind of feel, but it just feels very like sleek and mysterious and high end. Then you have games like Wingspan that just slap a giant, beautiful bird on the cover of it. And I love that because there's just no question what that game's about. They didn't spend a ton of time putting like a huge detailed background on there because they just wanted you to know that this game is about watching birds. And then you have Wavelength in the lower corner, and that really striking pattern is just great at catching your eyes, and it's just like a really beautiful color palette that they've gone with there. And you can tell like their goal for that game is like, hey, look here, there's contrast, it looks bright, it looks fun. Yeah, let's take a look at the next slide. So we collaborate with a lot of artists for our games. It's definitely a big part of the process to seek out the right artist for your project. And let's take a look at the next slide to kind of see this process. The workflow is we always start with a concepting phase. So what I'm usually doing for that is a lot of Google image searching, just trying to look up hot keywords for whatever themes we're looking at. And trying to just find inspiration from art that already exists. I think it's such a faster workflow to find things that you like rather than just in a bubble try and figure out what something might look like. But because people have made so much great content out there, and it's totally great and totally okay to pull inspiration from board games and other artistic sources that have done this type of thing before, and find your unique spin on it. But once we find an artistic style that we really like, then we start reaching out to artists and getting quotes on them. So we usually, we'll find artists online. There's a couple good subreddits for it. There's Our Hungry Artists, and there's some great Facebook groups I believe it's called Tabletop Game Artists. And so there's a lot of incredibly talented artists out there. And I always make a spreadsheet kind of marking little notes about all these different artists that I've seen and tracking all the price quotes we get for each of them. And eventually we'll move forward and start the artistic process. Now, the artistic process often lasts maybe 6 or more months. It's a lot of work for an illustrator. You certainly can't underestimate it, or you'll be in trouble there. But yeah, it's a lot of work to come up with that many original assets and the cycle of revisions that come along with it. It's important to know when to begin the art phase and to not do it too early so that you don't have to do too many revisions when your game will inevitably go through many changes. So it's best to kind of wait until your game design is in a really solid place. It doesn't have to be 100% done yet, but as long as you're like, yes, I know all these core components and game mechanisms will still be there, that's a great time to begin the artwork, and then you can kind of minimize some of the revisions that go along with it. So let's check out the next slide. Yeah. So here's some images of kind of how Canvas came along. When we are prototyping games, we don't have finished artwork. You know, we're not always sure what direction we want to go with the art, and we don't even always know if a game will make it into the final stages. So on the left there, you can kind of just see some mashups of some Google images that I had made. And this is for our game Canvas, which is a game about painting. And in the game, players are kind of mashing up different the art cards to create an illustration. So we started just by photoshopping stuff from the internet and printing those out on computer paper. And then on the right, in the top row, you can see one of our prototypes where we borrowed some artwork from Marie Cardoz Dixit, and we were kind of starting to narrow down our artistic style for the game, and we really fell in love with her artwork. We knew we wanted some sort of surreal paintings. So in our prototyping process, we started cutting out some of her images and pasting them together to see what that would look like. And when we realized that we really loved this painterly surreal style, we went ahead and we hired our illustrator Luan Huynh to illustrate these cards in his own beautiful oil painterly style. So that's what you can see at the bottom there, is he's illustrated some of these components and he's illustrated them on transparent cards, and in the game you layer those transparent cards together, and you can really see how they come together in that lower right completed painting card. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, so our boxes always go through just as many steps. So you can kind of see the progression of how the artwork came along before we had our illustrator create a much higher detailed version of the canvas box that we ended up being very happy, very proud of. So I have a copy of the game here that you can kind of see. And we did something kind of fun with this box. We always like to kind of take our packaging to the next level and almost treat it like a little prop in the world of the game. And in the case of Canvas, we actually made our box illustrated like a canvas itself, where it has a tiny little hanging hole and you can physically hang the box on your wall. And we recently just ran our Kickstarter campaign for the expansion for Canvas Reflections, where we did another fun illustrated thing where these boxes together form a diptych where it kind of continues the mural on. So we've used artwork in a lot of fun ways in our packaging design. You can go to the next slide. And yeah, so that's kind of, you know, the entry level of what we kind of think about when we're designing the artwork and graphic design for games.
Excellent. Thank you so much, guys. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. We're definitely going to re-record Andrew's part so everyone catches all the detail of the different artists you mentioned at the beginning. I think they're pretty prolific artists at this point, having created. So we want to make sure everyone catches those details. So we do have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to start. Road to Infamy is both your first game, but also now the name of your company. What was the transition like from being game designers to game publishers?
Yeah, so I mean, it was big transition when we started out. We were designing our first game, Road to Infamy, and it was just the two of us in our apartment. And it was something we did as a hobby, just for fun after work. And we ran our first Kickstarter campaign, and it was mostly kind of family and friends that kind of supported our first campaign. But it gave us enough hope to continue on, and here we are still making games. But it's a very different world now that we've got products on shelves in retail stores, and we're selling to people that we've never met in person. But it's such a cool feeling, and to me, that's like one of the most rewarding parts of what we do, is just knowing that like the art that we make, the game designs that we make, is, you know, being shared with people all over the world, and people that we may never meet, and they get to experience a little joy from that.
So how does, I mean, we've discussed this throughout, but is there any sort of obvious, I guess, templates, or how does art influence what you feel is the tone of the game?
Andrew, do you want to take that one? Is your audio working yet?
Yeah, it's working. I'm like, I feel better with just Jeff answering. Oh yeah, so how does art affect the tone of the game?
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, you can tell from even in our previous slides when we were looking at like family versus hobby. A more serious game is going to have darker shades and tones, and a little bit more complex art. And so, yeah, definitely what is put on the cover and put on the cards is directing the audience into what kind of experience they're expecting to have. If you have a bunch of very like bright, happy, anthropomorphic vegetables or something, then everyone's expecting a lighter, more fun experience.
We do have a few artists in the audience. We are interested in maybe designing the art in the board game. Do you have any like advice, like their networking priorities? How have you recruited artists? What are you looking for? And we actually did have a question that came through on Facebook. If you knew of any undergraduate programs you think that would recommend that would help you get into the industry.
Yeah, like I was saying, we find a lot of our artists online. There's some great subreddits and Facebook groups specifically geared towards artists for tabletop games. And I think it's great it's a great space to just kind of put your artwork out there, and show people what you can do in various styles. Yeah, I always look for artists who have a really great understanding of lighting and silhouetting, because in board games, because you're often illustrating on something so small, things need to read so obviously. And if you have really good lighting and just really good posing and contrast and color, you can like get those poses to read more instantly. And sometimes that's in board gaming like maybe a more important skill than being able to create like photorealistic, hyper detailed stuff. Again, it depends on the type of game you're illustrating for, but a lot of times it's important to have artwork that looks good even when it's small.
Yeah, that's major. Like with all the tiny little components, people need to be able to recognize which is which. Otherwise, yeah, then you're just digging through stuff and not sure what you're actually picking up. What are 3 suggestions that you would have to burgeoning game designers?
Oh, burgeoning game designers. Yeah. I'll do one of them. I think it's probably the most important thing I would say for a new game designer is to not be afraid to make changes to what you're working on. Just try new things. You can always go back to an old version, but you'll never get to the next step if you don't try new stuff. So always try and work and make your game better and different, and just try stuff out. It's kind of like a wild science experiment.
Yeah, and kind of kind of going along with that, be receptive to feedback and things that people are saying. It's something that I'm always trying to get better at, and I still struggle with sometimes, but it's as a game designer, your game is your baby, and I know like it's so natural to just feel so protective of what you've made, but it's also so important to listen to the people around you and what they're saying about your game, and be willing to make those changes, and you're making games for other people, not just for yourself. So make sure to value that outside opinion.
So I'm guessing playtesting is very, very, very
yes,
important.
yes.
I have another question in the audience. What is more important, the design of the game or the logistics of the gameplay?
It's all important. Every piece of it. The box art's important, the components inside. The rules, are they too wordy? Were you able to shorten them? Is everything understandable? I mean, maybe like 10 years ago, you could get away with not having the best art or not having a great technical writing skills. But like more and more, it's getting very competitive, and you have to have you have to have everything.
Yeah, there's just so many games coming out nowadays, like by the thousands a year. And like Andrew was saying, maybe like decades ago, there wasn't that type of competition, and yeah, you could get away with a lot more. But now with all that competition, your game needs to stand out. It needs to be the first game people see sticking out on the shelf or on the top of the Kickstarter page, and everything comes down to not only just having a good game, but also having really striking visual presence.
Do you each have, all right, that's your, I know you mentioned earlier your current favorite games. Do you have like an all-time favorite game, each of you? Board game?
I still love Scythe. It's been my favorite game for years, and I've lately been so addicted to playing it online on Steam, because we've all been stuck at home without our gaming groups, and so it's been my only outlet to get that game played. And it's so compelling, and part of it is because that artwork by Jaka Brazovsky is just puts you in that world. It's just so unique, and he just accomplishes so much with what he does. And I mean, if you're not familiar with the game, check it out, even if just for the artwork. He does a lot with a little. With just like small brush strokes, he creates like a lot of detail with the mechs and the little people and the rice fields. It's such an interesting combination of elements. But yeah, it's so good, and for so many reasons.
And Andrew?
Favorite game right now? I don't know. They're all good. I feel like it's a very like,
You might have to come back to that.
Yeah, we lost you, Andrew.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to apologize for the tech difficulties. We do plan to repair this fully, so you'll be able to enjoy it and see all of Andrew's initial information that he relayed at the beginning. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions and participating. Tonight's program will be available on Chicago Public Library's YouTube page starting tomorrow. So if you have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, fans of other games like Cosmocracy or Crypt or any of the other awesome games Road to Infamy has designed, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublib.org. Thank you, Jeff and Andrew, and to everyone for tuning in. Have a great night and stay well.